Sitting in the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio is a big Grand Trunk Western U3B 484 that formerly operated on the Ohio Central Railroad. Grand Trunk Western number 6325 is a big northern type locomotive that operated on the Grand Trunk Western and the Ohio Central Railroad. Now in the ownership of the Age of Steam Roundhouse, the locomotive awaits her 1472-day inspection test to return to service. Despite being out of service, number 6325 is going to be the spotlight for today's documentary.
It's February of 1942. The American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, finished building Grand Trunk Western number 6325, a U3B class 484 Norton. This type of locomotive was built for heavy freight trains or fast passenger trains due to its strength and large drivers. Its large size was also useful for hauling wartime freight trains across the upper Midwest. Number 6325 has a length of 95 feet, a width of 10 feet, and a height of 15 feet. The engine has an enormous weight of 403,000 pounds, with the tender adding another 270,500 pounds for a combined weight of 673,500 pounds. The coal capacity of the engine is 32,000 pounds, with the water capacity capped at 14,300 gallons. The locomotive's tractor effort is 59,034, with a driver diameter of 73 inches. This engine class was also very efficient. The engine could go 250,000 miles without heavy repairs. After her construction, the locomotive began running passenger trains for the Grand Trunk Western, totaling 16 passenger cars when she wasn't hauling passenger trains. The locomotive was pulling 80 freight trains over Chicago Division on the Grand Trunk Western. The locomotive and the subsequent class were all very popular with crews, citing the ease of operation the locomotive and the large strength that the engine had. From 1942 and 1948, the locomotive hauled freight and passenger trains over the rails of the Grand Trunk Western until her first special excursion. In 1948 was an election year for the United States. Harry Truman, the former vice president, and Thomas Dewey. Truman held a campaign train across the United States. Number 6325 had a special honor of hauling presidential campaign train across Michigan on GTW trackage. When traveling on Michigan, the locomotive operated between Flint to Battle Creek, Michigan for the presidential campaign. A campaign that would pay off as Truman would win the re-election. The locomotive went back to operating freight and passenger trains for the Grand Trunk Western for another 11 years. By the mid-1950s, the Grand Trunk had finally started to dieselize after years of slow transitions. The rest of the locomotive on the railroad were retired from service by the late 1950s. In October 1959, 6325 was formally retired from service.
With number 6325 now in storage, the locomotive seemed destined to go to the scrapper's yard. But fortunately, because of the engine's historical significance pulling Harry Truman's Presidential Express, it was selected to be placed on static display and to be donated by the Grand Trunk Western to the city of Battle Creek, Michigan the same year it was retired. A fundraiser for the engine's cosmetic restoration was promoted by the National Association of Power Engineers. They raised $215.73 for the engine. Before the engine could be placed on display, the railroad applied a nice, fresh coat of paint to the engine from the fundraiser as the permanent outdoor spot was finalized. The engine's move wasn't without controversy. Some citizens worried that the engine's space would be too small, but plans for the locomotive went forward and the location was finalized. The plan was for number 6325 to be moved to Hall Street across Battle Creek Station. On the 9th of July, 1960, number 6325 was moved across the street to its new home in Battle Creek, Michigan, and a dedication ceremony was held on July 15th. Fast forwarding 15 years, the city did very little with the locomotive and no maintenance was being done on the engine. Since the engine lived in the heart of Lower Michigan, the winter storms and summer heat began to take their toll on the engine. By 1985, the Greater Battle Creek Foundation, in conjunction with a group called 6325 Turntable, began collecting funds to restore the old locomotive to operational condition. With the restoration beginning, the groups went to the city of Battle Creek and discussions began to sell the locomotive. The plan for the group was to acquire the locomotive and operate it on mainline excursions in Michigan. 1 year after restoration funds began, the city of Battle Creek agreed to sell the locomotive to the 6325 Turntable Foundation for the bargain price of just $1 in 1986. That same month, the group moved the locomotive to the Franklin Iron and Metal Company building to keep the engine stored there for restoration. A year after the locomotive was moved, restoration work was finally commenced. Several years passed and the future looked promising for the historic locomotive. Tragically, the group was asked to move the engine out of the building and find a new home for the engine. The group, though, had to pay to move the engine and find a new home, money that the group did not have. With no way to move the engine, the foundation went under, and this left the engine stuck in the building with a very uncertain future. This is where local railroad president named Jerry Jacobson is intertwined into the story. He owned the regional Ohio Central Railroad and was a fanatic of steam power. He was made aware of the locomotive situation and quickly began drawing up plans for the locomotive. In 1993, he purchased the engine. The relief was immense as Jacobson worked out the kinks to get the locomotive from Michigan to Ohio. Later that year, he moved the engine to Coshocton, Ohio for safe storage until Jacobson had the moment and place to begin its refurbishment. Five years later, in 1998, he moved the engine to the Ohio Central Shops in Morgan Run, Ohio. Restoration efforts began on the engine, with many volunteers and paid employees working on the locomotive. 3 years had passed since the engine was moved to the workshops, and the engine's restoration was almost complete by early 2001. That summer, on July 31, 2001, Grand Trunk Western number 6325 was fired up and she moved under her own power for the first time in 42 years.
There she goes! Alright! Yeah! Woo-hoo!
Immediately, management at the railroad began drawing up plans for the locomotive's very first excursion. That event came 3 months later in September when the announcement was made that the historic locomotive was to make its first excursion between Denison to Columbus, Ohio. When that September rolled around, the locomotive was fired up, and on September 22, 2001, the locomotive took its very first excursion train in the stable and secure hands of Jerry Jacobson. In the following years, the locomotive would routinely operate trips on the Ohio Central to towns like Columbus, Sugar Creek, and Coshocton. It also routinely operated photo charter events. All of the locomotive's excursions were very well received, with many traveling to the railroad to see the popular steam excursion program in action. However, the locomotive's most well-known moment was in 2004. Train Festival 2004 was hosted on the Ohio Central from July 30th to August 1st in Denison, Ohio. The railroad pulled out all the stops for the event with steam locomotives like Canadian Pacific No. 1293 and Flag Coal Company No. 75. Historic diesel locomotives also appeared. The event was a massive hit with rail fans and locals, with 6325 and 1293 hauling the heavy excursions up and down the line. After the showcase of steam, things were to turn sour for number 6325. Shortly after the locomotive operated at the festival, the engine was forced out of service due to hot driving axle bearings. Repairs commenced on the locomotive, but she was stored for a very long time inside the barn. 4 years passed with the locomotive inside the barn, and there was no sign of her returning to service. Inside the Ohio Central Railroad, though, is a very different story. By 2008, Jerry Jacobson had decided to retire from the railroad industry at the age of 65. He sold all of his shares of the Ohio Central to the Genesee and Wyoming Railroad that year for $219 million. Retired, Jacobson needed a place to store his collection of steam locomotives, and thus the Age of Steam Roundhouse was conceived. Completed in 2011, Jacobson moved all of his collection from the Ohio Central to a town called Sugar Creek, Ohio. In 2011, number 6325 and the rest of his collection was moved to the Roundhouse. After all of his engines moved, restoration on the engine began to stall. The crew at the Roundhouse began to focus their efforts on restoring other steam locomotives in their collection. With that, the engine just sat there in the Roundhouse, unfinished. Even after Jerry Jacobson passed away at the age of 74, the locomotive was still in the Roundhouse, incomplete. And that is where the locomotive sits today.
Grand Trunk Western 6325's history is one of bouncing around before finding a permanent and stable home. From Grand Trunk to town-owned, to non-profit owned, to privately owned, this locomotive, though not fully restored, has a stable home and is cared for well by the people in charge of the Age of Steam Roundhouse. The Grand Trunk Western 6325 is a locomotive that will someday ride the wheels again in honor of her late owner. She is the Ohio Central's cornerstone.